Hey, so I wanted to go over what I was talking about with float variables and how they work on the animation timeline in Unreal. So what I did is I started already out with a brand new user widget, and I just put a progress bar in it, progress bar sample, and I have it here in like the center top of the screen. And I've also already tied it to the third person character. I went ahead and made like a third person sample project. And I'm casting it to the viewport on play so that when we play it, it's going to show up right there in the top center of the screen. And so this way, I can show you how we can drive a lot of things in the UI animation-wise with just some float variables and how powerful that is. The first thing I'm going to do is I'm going to create an animation, and I'm just going to name it anim test. I'm going to capitalize that T. And then I'm going to select it, and then I'm going to say track all named widgets and this, which grabs like the whole thing. Then I'm going to go to the graph, and I'm going to say variables, add a variable, and I'm going to name it the same thing that I named my animation. This is important because if you don't do this, then it doesn't connect all the dots. And I'm going to call this value. Sorry, not with an S. I'm going to make it a float. And the reason that we make this a float is because progress bar percents work from 0 to 1, just like floats do. So floats can work on decimals. Integers are whole numbers, so we don't want to do that because if we use an integer, it's just going to jump from 0 to 1. We want all these numbers in between to get a nice, even, flowing progress bar. So that's why we're using a float. And a float is actually used for the animations for that reason, for getting nice, even, smooth animations. And then right here, when we go back to the timeline in the designer view, we hit track. Oh, I skipped a step. Actually, when you make the variable, you want to go in here and say expose to cinematics. And that's actually going to make it viewable to the timeline. So we go back to designer view now and hit track. It's right there at the very top, anim test value, and we want to put that on the timeline, and we're going to go from 0, 0, to 1, and 1. So now our animation goes from 0 to 1. And we're going to set these to linear. That way we don't have any weird curves, weird random things going on in our animation. It's just a straight 0 to 1. There's no funky business going on. And then what we're going to do is we're going to create a function, a new function, and we're going to name that function the same thing that we named our variable. So we're going to say set anim test value, just like that. And again, we named it this way so that these all connect the dots to each other, because if you don't, then the animation doesn't work. And so we click this bad boy together in the execution pin, and then we take this and make it an input of the animation. Now what we can do is we can take the progress bar, bring that bad boy in, get him, and set his percent off of the animation. Just like this. Ta-da! Look at that. And then we go to the event graph, and we'll say on event construct, play animation, and I'm going to set this to 0 so it just keeps playing infinitely, and then drag the animation in here and put it in there. And now, if you go back into designer view, because you should be able to get a preview of this, you can see the actual bar filling up due to the animation. And when I hit play in the game, it does the same thing. So it just keeps filling up and keeps repeating. And it's just great. We get a nice smooth animation. And this is why we use floats on progress bars and not integers. We don't have any skips. It's just a nice smooth fill. Okay, so next thing we're going to move into is going to be very blueprint heavy. So just a fair warning, we're going to do quite a bit of scripting here, but I'm going to show you another reason why we animate on the timeline like this with a float variable. Okay, so we're going to create a blueprint function library, which is this guy right here. So we're going to create him, and I'm just going to call him UI function library for the time being. And he's going to house basically a bunch of blueprint scripts that we can use in tons of other blueprints over and over again without having to like rewrite this a bazillion times. Because if you're going to use this for animations, you're going to use it a lot, and it's going to be shared across a lot of widgets. So that's a nice thing about function libraries, is that you can do that. Now, the bad thing about function libraries is you have to be very careful about how you use them, because if you have references in them to anything, anytime this library is used anywhere in any widget, it will pull in the entire library of functions that you have made in it and any references that it calls. So you need to be very careful about how many functions that you house in these. I would break these down into very specific bite-sized chunks. Like if you're going to use these, I would make one for like animations. I would make one for if you're going to use them for any kind of color functions, any kind of like logic for like skill trees or anything like that. Like I would make a specific function library for each one. For this one, we're just going to make it for animations. And we're going to start off with an animation that I'm going to call UI set animation phases. Now, the reason I call this animation phases is because what this is going to allow us to do is two things. We are going to tap into Unreal's default easing system to make finer, better looking animations. And we're also going to be able to break the timeline down into little chunks. That's why I call them phases. So instead of having to only have an animation go from 0 to 1, I'm going to be able to break it up and say, like, maybe I only want the animation to go from 0 to 0.3, and then I want it to like fade on at that point. But then in the animation from like 0.8 to 1, I want the widget to fade off. Well, with this, I'm going to be able to do that because I'll be able to break up the animations this way. Okay, so when I make this animation, I'm going to want 2 inputs and 1 output. So for the inputs, I'm going to put the first one as a phases array, and it's going to be a 2D vector, or I'm sorry, a vector 2D. I always get those mixed up. So it's going to be a vector 2D, and I'm going to change this little guy right here, and I'm going to make him an array. Instead of just a single variable, he's going to wind up being an array of 2D vectors. Now, the reason he's a 2D vector is because we want an x and y float value. Because we're working in 2D, we only have 2 axes to animate on, the x and the y. So that's why it's a vector 2D. And then the next thing we're going to make is what we're going to call a timeline variable. And it's going to directly correlate to the timeline in Unreal, and it's going to be a float just like we had in our animation. And then the last thing we're going to do, funny enough, is output an integer. And we're going to call this current phase. Now, the reason that the return is an integer is because what we're going to be doing is a for loop, and we're going to want it to return an array index. And basically what that is it's a list, and it's like a list in a table, and each row has a number, and we want those to be whole solid numbers, what the array index returns, and I'll show you what I mean in a minute. So we're going to disconnect those for a second, and this bad boy's going to go over here. And what we're going to start off with right here is we're going to branch. I'll make a branch right there. And for its condition, what we're going to say is that we want to get the phases array, our little array that we had made in here, right here. And we want the last index of that array, just like that. And then from this integer right here that it returns, we want to get a copy from this same array. Get in there. So we're going to get a copy of what that last index was. And we're going to say that, or we're going to ask it if, oh, I'm sorry. First off, we're going to break this. So we're getting that x and y right here. We're going to take the y of this, and we're going to ask, are you greater than, actually no, sorry. He's going to go in the bottom. We're going to ask, are you greater than the timeline variable? And that's going to be our condition. Now, again, this is all very script heavy. I know it can be kind of confusing, so I'm going to try and just get through this because it's a lot. I'm going to explain what I can of it without getting too bogged down in the scripting language. But for the most part, once I get it all put together, you'll see kind of like why it's this way. Basically, this is to make sure that it doesn't go over whatever the value of the timeline is, so that we're staying in that 0 to 1 range. Now, if it's true, we're going to return a current phase of 0. We're going to tell it that it's 0. But if it's false, then we're going to put a for each loop, just like this, over here, of the phase array. So we're going to grab this phase array again, because he's our array. He's what we're breaking down. We are going to break the array element into the 2D vector of its x and y. And we are going to grab the timeline again. I'm just going to copy and paste it because it's easier this way for me. And we're going to say, of these guys, in range, float, because we're dealing with floats. And we're going to clamp it to a min and max range of x and y. And this does the same thing as like a regular like clamp float. Again, we're just trying to keep things in the timeline from 0 to 1. We don't want it to go past any of that, or else it'll break our animations. And we're going to put this into a branch, another branch. And that's going to be our condition. These stay in their min and max range. And then we're going to return again. Copy and paste this bad boy. If it's true, we're going to return the current phase of the animation that we're in, like which table it's in. Okay. And again, like I said, this is pretty script heavy. But when I'm all done, it will all make sense, I promise. So this is our first function. Now I'm going to make a second function that ties into this. We're going to start that. Okay, so for our next function, create a whole new function, and I'm going to call this one UI ease values by phase. Now this is where we get into tapping into Unreal's default easing system, so we can make those nice, more refined animations. So what we're going to do in this one is we're going to have 3 inputs for this and 1 output. And the first input we're going to make is going to be, I'm going to call this one phases map. That's not how you spell map. And I'm going to make this a 2D vector, or a vector 2D. And this guy I'm going to change into a map dictionary, just like that. And then what it's going to tie into is that easing function library that Unreal has. So it's basically going to make a table of x and y vectors into the easing function library. And that's how we're going to get those nice refined animations. And then I'm going to make a value array, and it's going to be a 2D vector as well, but we're going to change it back to just a plain old simple array. It's not going to be that map dictionary. And that's where we're going to set, drive the values of like how much opacity it has, or, you know, when we fade it and things like that. I'll show you when we get closer to animating it. I'm also going to make another float for the timeline. And then our output is also going to be a float. Okay. But these are not going to be arrays. These are just going to be single value variables, just like that. Okay, I'm going to go ahead and compile that and drag this guy over here. Okay, and then what I'm going to do is I'm going to do something similar to what we did over here. I'm going to start with our phases, but this time we're going to have our phases map. So get phases map, and we're going to get the keys inside this phases map. And then we are going to set from the keys so from here, you're going to take this and you're going to make a local variable. And the reason that we do this is because we don't want anything else like messing with this. And we're going to call this phases array. That's what it is. It's an array. And that's going to set, those keys are going to set it. And then we're going to grab the phases map again. I'm just going to move this guy up here. And we're going to grab the values inside of this map. And then we're also going to make another variable. And we're going to call this, didn't give me the chance to, oh, I missed it, easing array for all of our easing values. Now that UI set animation phases that we just made, we're going to pull that in here now. And we're going to use this that we just made, and we're going to plug in the phases array to here. We're going to plug in the timeline variable from this function into here. And then from that, we're going to grab whatever the array's current phase is, and we're going to set it from here. Call it current phase. And then we're going to set the return node right here. Now here's where it starts to get a little complicated, because obviously we need to plug something in here. And what we need to plug in here is how we're going to get our easing phases. So what we're going to do is we're going to grab the phases array, and we're going to grab the current phase, and we're going to get a copy of this. We're going to plug the current phase into it, and I'm also going to grab the timeline variable, and we're going to say map range clamped, and that's again so we have that 0 to 1 value and they don't get bigger than that. We want to stay within 0 to 1, so we say in range A, in range B, and then here we say 0 to 1. And then we're going to put that into this easing function that comes standard in Unreal. And then that's going to go in here. Now what we're going to do, so that we can pick this, like right now we have a drop down right here of all the easing values that we can use inside of Unreal, but we don't want to set that here. We want to set that in the animation when we make the animation. So what we're going to do is we are going to grab the easing array, And we're going to grab the current phase again. Come here, buddy. And we're going to get a copy of that and plug the current phase into there. And then we're going to get oops. If I can type, get the values array. And we're going to get the current phase again. A lot of copying and pasting of stuff. And do the same thing. Hey, buddy. Get a copy. Plug that current phase into there. So they're all looking at the same phase at the same time. And then break this down to its X and Y value again. And then we're going to plug this easing into here to expose that in the animation when we make it. I'll show you how that works in a second. And then we're going to take these guys and put them into the A and B values so that we can set those values. The blend I put to 1, and then the steps are going to be dictated by the current phase of the animation. So a little bit of debugging. So you notice that I have all these errors in here, and that's because, like I had said before, these are supposed to be local variables. They're not supposed to be just regular public variables. So I went ahead and I made a new one, but I'll show you what I mean. So like right here, the phases array, if I go in here and I delete that, yes please, and it deletes them all out of here, and I start using this guy instead, who is a local variable, like that. And I'll plug this bad boy in here. And I compile now. You notice that that error went away for that variable. Like now that it's a local variable, it went away. And that's because you don't want anything but this function using that variable. You don't want this to be exposed anywhere else. Only this function should set that variable. Let me go back and do that for the rest of these guys and get rid of these errors real quick. Okay, and we're back. And so now I've made all of these local variables, and we have no more errors anymore. They're all set up, ready to go. So now we can start animating using our easing library and get some pretty cool results. So we go back to our HUD here, and we go back into our animation for set anim test value. What I can do now is I can pull this aside, and in the percent I can say UIE's variable values by phase. This is the function that we made in the function library, and as you can tell, it's got a float out, and then it has that phase map with the easings that we made, and then it has a value array of those vector 2Ds and a timeline variable. Now, timeline goes in here just like that. So this is our float value that's actually set on the timeline right here from 0 to 1, and that's what's going to drive our animation forward. We're going to pull out our phase map, and we're going to promote it to a variable. And what I like to do is I like to keep them together in the animation so I know like what animation's referencing this. So what I'll do is I'll say test, just like the animations is anim test. So I'll say test, and then I'll say percent phase map. And there are the values array. I'll do something very similar. I'll promote to a variable, and I'll say test percent, because that's what we're setting. We're setting the percent of this progress bar, and I'm going to call this values. Okay. And then in order to edit these, bring this bad boy down here, I'm going to hit compile. Now, when I bring this up, you'll notice that I have the ability to add elements to this map. And when I hit the little plus sign, it's going to say vector 2D, which is what we made. It's the X and Y values. And then we're going to say it has value. And then there's the list of all of the easings that we have. So let's just say ease in for the first one. And let's just say on the timeline, I only want this section of the animation to affect the first third of our animation. So from 0 to 0.3 of the animation, which if we go back into the designer is going to be from here to here. So this whole section is the only time in the timeline that's going to be affected. I'm going to tell it the easing value that I want is ease in. And now let's say I want another section. Actually, you know what? Let's just leave it like this. Let's keep it simple for right now so I can show you what it does. Now on here, I can actually set and drive the values. So from here, I can say 0 to 1. So maybe now, when we look at it, it's going to jump. If you look at the progress bar up here, it did work. So basically what I'm showing you now is that instead of taking up this whole timeline to fill up, now from 0, if you notice, to 0.3, now the progress bar fills. So it's not going all the way to the end anymore, it's finishing early. Now, I added an image so you could see how this works for like things like fade-ons and fade-offs, because this is usually what I use it for the most. So what I do is I created this image and I plugged that in to the same values. So from 0 to 0.3, it's going to ease in, and then the actual opacity is going to go from 0 to 1, just like it would right here. So when I scrub the timeline, oh, sorry, I have to compile first. It's not going to do it until I compile. So now when I scrub the timeline, if you notice in its details, the render opacity is at 0 when it's 0 on the timeline, and then as I slowly scrub through, you can see it come into focus at 0.3 at full opacity. In the engine, this is what it looks like. And you notice it's a smoother animation. It's not just a stop on, stop off. And I'll show you, like, if we go back, and let's say I take this and I just go linear, so it's just going to be a straight 0 to 1. There's going to be no easing in it at all. See how much more abrupt that is? But now we have all these different nice easings that we can work with. I can go circular out, and then I can actually go in here and I can change, like, let's just put this to like 06 so that you can have like a longer animation to see what it's doing. And one other thing you can do with this too is, let's say, you know, you want the animation to be longer than just a second. So here's what I typically do. To make these animations like longer, so I can stretch them out, instead of going in here and messing with this on the timeline and stretching it to like 0.3, because you get some nasty results with that. You could get some weird, crappy things going on with your animation, and then you have to spend all this time debugging it. Instead, what I do is I go in here and I manipulate this value, the playback speed. Now, the playback speed is in frames. It is not in seconds. So what I do to kind of better wrap my head around like how long an animation is going to be is I will divide this by 1, and then the bottom number is however long you want the animation to be. So let's say I want it to be 3 seconds, so I put a 3 in the bottom. And then I go back into, I'm so sorry, the animation itself, and see now this animation is 3 seconds long. And that's for something like someone like me who, like, I don't want to have to think about, you know, like how many frames it's going to be for a second, if I had to divide that to make it shorter. So if I have to go back and I have to say to myself, okay, well, I want this to be half a second now, I just put 0.5 in here. It's half a second. And then when I play it, see how much faster it is now? Because in my head, it always goes backwards with this, because for playback speed in the way it is right now, if I put 0.5 in here, I'll show you what it does. It actually makes it slower. So slower number in playback speed makes the animation longer instead of the reverse. So for me, I do it this way because it's a closer 1-to-1 for me. I know exactly, like, if I put a 5 in here, that animation is going to be 5 seconds long. If I put a 3 in there, it's going to be 3 seconds long. So it's just easier for me to wrap my brain around. But yeah, and this is how I use the animation system. And you can use this for anything. You can make similar functions like this to animate color. You can animate opacity. You can animate translation. So if I can do the same thing with this image and set render translation, and then I break this, split the pin structure. So I have my X and Y values here, those 2D vectors again. And let's just say I want to play around with the Y value. So I go in here into the values section, and I'll say, I want this to move, let's see, 25 units in the Y axis. So it's going to go up and down. So if I go down here, sorry, I got to minimize this, and I hit play again. See, it's moving. It's moving down, and then it's going to reset in the animation. I'm going to make that more dramatic. I can go in here and say, okay, how about 200? And play it again. See, look at that. And I get these really cool animations now, and I can have like these really cool easing values, and it gives you a little bit more finesse with like how you can animate stuff in the UI. And it's not just like these very blunt start and stops. You can start doing some really cool, really nice animations with this system. And it also makes it really easy to edit. Like if you decide to come in here and you're like, oh, I want that animation to be, you know, shorter or longer, I can just come in here and edit a value. I don't have to go in here and play with this timeline and just like, you know, noodle with it forever, or have all these different values right here that I'm playing with. Like, you know, normally you'd have, if you wanted to animate this, you'd have to, you know, grab the actual image, and then you'd have to do, okay, I want to do color, and then I also want to do transform, and I want to do visibility, and I have to like go in here and like move all this around. I don't have to do that anymore. All I have to do is go into my function and grab that image again, that variable for that image, just like this. And now I can control it all with just this easing phase. And if I want them to be different, that's totally great. I can do that too. So watch this. So I'll just take this and I'll copy and I'll paste it. And I'll put him in his little target there. And I'll move him over. And let me unplug him from there. And I'll just take this and this. And I'll copy and paste this here. So he's going to have his own now. And he's going to plug in here. Get those guys torn apart. And the same thing, like I'm going to create my variables, and I'm going to say this is test, this is opacity, phase map, and then values are the same thing, create a variable, and I'm going to say test, opacity, values. And let's say I want it now, we'll do a two-part phase. So here we go, we're gonna hit the plus sign, and I'm gonna say from 0 to 0.3, I want a, this sounds cool, I'm gonna do a sinusoidal in, and then I'm gonna make a second phase now, and I'm gonna look at the end of the animation. So from 0.8 to 1, I'm gonna do a ease in and out. Let's do that. Let's play around with that and see what that looks like. And now in my values, this is where it might get a little tricky. So this is your first phase right here, and this is your second phase. And again, this is the beginning of the phase and the end of the phase. So for my opacity, what I want is for it to start at 0 in the first phase and end at 1. So it's going to be completely transparent and then completely opaque. And then at the end of it, I want it to fade out. So I want it to be starting at 1 and then ending at 0. So it's going to be full opacity here, and then it's going to be completely transparent at the end. And I'll go back to the designer and show you what that's going to look like. So, and now it works. If you notice, you can see that. I'll show you what it looks like in game. So if I click on play, see it fades on, and then it should fade right off. There it goes. So fade on, fade off. And now you have all of that tied into one nice animation. And if you want to change the values, let's say you want to go in here and you want to only have it go to half opacity, so 0.5 instead of 1. And let's say you want this to come on, the fade on to be a lot slower. We'll say this is 0.5, but you want the fade off to be shorter. Let's go to 0.9. All you have to do is tweak these little values. You know, you want to do different easing. So we'll say ease in, and then on this one we'll say circular in, compile that, and then we'll hit the play button. And look at that. It only goes half opacity, and then it fades back out over his little butt. And you get a lot of really awesome distance with these animations, a lot of versatility with these animations, and they're easy to edit. Like once you make them, they're easy to edit. And let's say you want to make a second animation and you want it to be just like the first one. Easy. You go back into your function here, and you can just copy and paste like a lot of these values. Like let's say I make a new function, and we'll make it set anim second value. Remember, naming is important. And then go in here, and it's a float, and we're going to expose it to cinematics, compile, and we're going to go in here, we're going to make a second one in here, second, and we say this, and we say second value, 0 to 1, linear, linear, and then we do the same thing with this guy here. I'm going to play both these animations, but instead of the test one, we're going to pull in the second one. And let's say we want to make the same animation, but with a different image. So I pop in a new image here. And I'm just going to put him over here. Let's just do that. And I'm going to make him 250 by, let's say 100. Let's make him bigger. Okay? Well, all I have to do now, basically, is, what I can do is just copy and paste all this stuff, if I want to. Oops. Forgot to bring in the actual variable, because that's what's going to drive the animation, remember? Need him. And we just start plugging in these values. The same exact values, except on a new image. And there you go. And then when I play it in the engine, look at that. Of course, it's animating everything now, but you get the idea. It's very powerful and very useful. So yeah, so that's animating on the timeline with floats and using the Unreal Easing library. If you guys have any questions, just reach out to me and let me know. I'll try to answer them as best I can. But yeah, for now, that's it. So I hope you enjoy animating this way now.